Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second session of the 15th Annual Human Rights in Asia Conference. My name is Imaue Muñoz Carrasco, and with my colleague, Erika Regalado, we will be your conference presenters today. As human rights advocates, it is our utmost pleasure to be part of this meaningful event hosted by the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex. We express our sincerest gratitude to all of you who have taken the time to join us today, wherever you may be. We will also like to extend our appreciation to the conference speakers and members of Essex Law School who have joined us to support this important cause. Just a quick reminder, this entire session will be recorded and uploaded to the Human Rights Center YouTube channel for future viewing. We encourage you to interact with our speakers and fellow attendees through the chat, where you may ask questions at any time. Rest assured that all questions will be collected and answered by the speakers at a later time. If you have any other questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of our conference team members through private messaging. Now, we would like to officially welcome you all to the second session of the 15th Annual Human Rights in Asia Conference. This edition is about the human rights impact of the fashion industry in Asia. In the first session, we went over the working conditions of garment workers in Asia and living wages and their impact on economic, social, and cultural rights. In today's session, we will cover topics on migrants and women, business and human rights, and sustainable practices in the garment industry. For the first segment, we have the pleasure of introducing you Dr. Arjun Kharel. Dr. Kharel is an assistant professor of sociology at Tribhuvan University and a research fellow at the Center of the Study of Labor and Mobility. His interest in how migration impacts the country of origins, specifically on labor migration research to international destinations and internal migration, and on migrant workers within the construction industry in Nepal. Today, he will be sharing his expertise on the position of migrants and women and the labor makeup within the fashion industry. Dr. Kharel, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and also for inviting me to this conference. Okay, I think I'll start the presentation. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about Nepal-Jordan migration corridor. This study was conducted a couple of years back. And for this same study, we had interviewed some workers in the pre-migration phase, as well as during their employment in Jordan. And I myself had traveled to Jordan a couple of times for this study. And so my presentation will highlight the recruitment cost, wages and working conditions for women migrant workers in garment industry in Jordan. And just to provide you a context, then okay, so in this presentation, so at first okay, I'll discuss the working and living conditions of migrant workers in garment industry in Jordan, and I also try to highlight how this sector of employment compares with other major employment sectors, as well as workers' conditions in other major destinations of migrant workers, particularly migrant workers from Nepal. And then also I try to highlight how different actors can work in different ways to improve the working and the living conditions of our migrant workers in the Jordanian garment industry. So if you are not aware of the garment industry in Jordan, then so garment industry factories in Jordan are established in special economic zones, or what they are called the QIG, qualified industrial zones. And these industries are owned and operated by multinational companies, and they are headquartered elsewhere. And they have established these factories in Jordan because of this agreement between Jordanian government and the U.S. government, through which U.S. government provides this low tariff, or actually no tariff, on Jordanian products. And so these companies are producing in Jordan for for US market. So basically how they do it is they have to also, I think, get some raw materials from Israel, and then they produce in Jordan by workers from mostly South Asia and Southeast Asian countries, and they sell the product in US. So in these garment factories, there were about 75,000 migrant workers in 2022, and most of them were women. And so most of these workers are migrant workers, but there are also some local, they make local Jordanian workers, and they make a quarter of the workers. Jordan also has a huge number of refugees from Syria and Palestine, but these companies prefer on hiring migrant workers, and you could hardly find these factories hiring refugees. So this presentation is based on interview conducted with 13 women migrant workers from Nepal, and they were employed in 3 different garment factories in Jordan. And yeah, well, I myself had conducted interviews, and with some of them, and my colleague also did the same. So we conducted interviews at the worker center, and also at dormitories and factory conference room. So about the recruitment process in Nepal, so these there are some recruitment agencies in Nepal, and they work with the employer companies in Jordan, and they supply these migrant workers. When what we found was, compared to other major destination countries, migration cost was very low. Actually, most workers did not pay any money for their migration to Jordan, and but on average the cost was Nepali rupee 5,000. That's like for $40, and that was for medical screening departure. But there were a couple of workers who had paid up to 20,000 Nepali rupees, or US dollar 160, but that amount was taken by intermediaries, labor intermediaries, who connected these migrant workers with the recruitment agencies in Nepal. So for comparison, then if the average migration cost to Gulf countries and Malaysia is of $1,500, or that's more than 5-6 months salary. And most workers take loans to pay for their migration to Gulf countries and Malaysia. But in the case of Jordan, then we did not find any workers actually taking loans to pay for their migration cost, which was a good thing because it did not increase their family debt. So one question that I was thinking is, like, then why is migration cost significantly low for employment in Jordanian garment factories? Then obviously most workers in Nepal I found not preferring to go to Jordan. So these are like less desirable jobs, and the wages are low. And also similar mechanisms were found in terms of domestic workers traveling to Gulf countries. So when we had conducted studies on domestic workers, I mean, all of them were women, then they were not paying significant amount of money for jobs in mostly GCC countries, because the demand was high, and then employers were willing to spend money for recruitment of workers. A similar situation was there, maybe like multinational companies, where also maybe they were concerned about recruitment cost and their corporate image. So then they were willing to send money to these origin countries to recruit workers. So in the case of migration to Gulf countries and Malaysia, especially in the formal sector, then although there are bilateral agreements, then we do not find the destination countries and companies respecting those bilateral agreements and recruiting workers free of cost. So in terms of wages, the wages were low. So workers would earn between $170 to $260 per month, but that would include overtime work and bonuses as well. And on average, they would save 135 to 230 US dollar per month. But all of them were working overtime, at least like 2 hours of overtime work per day. But most workers were not actually able to calculate how much money they would earn, because it was a bit complicated, and especially they had difficulty in calculation because of this overtime work every month, and also they wouldn't exactly know how much bonus they would receive every month. In terms of how they perceive their wages, so most of them thought that wages were too low compared to the work they had to do. So they worked for 6 days a week, and then 10 hours a day. So normally from 7 or 7:30 a.m. up to 6 p.m. So if they would start at 7:30, they would just have a half-hour lunch break. But if they would start a bit earlier, then they would also have tea breaks in addition to lunch break. So they would work continuously for 6 days, and then 8 hours of regular work plus 2 hours of overtime work daily. So the workers also would have certain target set for each line, and then if they would not meet the target, then they were required to stay longer, and then they were forced to work extra hours to meet the target. And for that extra hour of work, they wouldn't receive any money. But those things would not be recorded, so that would be off the record. So yeah, one migrant worker shared her experience of working until very late when she was unable to meet the target. So meeting target was very important, and other colleagues at the same line would also be very unhappy if they were unable to meet the target, because if one worker was slow, then that would affect everyone. And that was also the reason of the conflict among workers. So I'll come to this point a bit later. So regarding this overtime work and payment, so workers would be paid extra for their overtime work, and also most workers viewed overtime work positively, because that would give them an opportunity to improve their income, which was very low. But workers would become ill, or sometimes the work would be too much, and they would need rest. And at that time, they would hope that the overtime, they wished that the overtime work was optional. So working for 8 hours, and including the break time, it would be 9 hours in the factory. That would be too much for them. Oh, actually, including the overtime work, it would be nearly 11 to 12 hours in the factory. And during the like festival time, like Christmas time in the US, and they had to complete those products, and they would not even get the holiday. Like they had to work on weekend as well. So the work would be too much. So overall, the working conditions is for the workers were not very satisfactory. They found the work too difficult and monotonous, and the job contract would be of normally for 3 years. But in case of Nepali workers, I found many of them actually returning home after completing 2 years. And some of them returned after 1 year of work because they could not bear it. So it was monotonous, highly demanding, and uninteresting because they were doing the same work every day, and they were involved. Each of them was involved in a very small piece of work, and it would not be interesting. So you could see alienation at the workplace. And some workers reported of numb and swollen feet due to continuous standing for a long period of time. And in the case of Nepali workers, they were not used to that kind of work, and they also did not have prior experience in Nepal. Only one of them had the experience of working in garment factory. And some of them reported of illness, frequent illness due to work pressure. And also they said that they would not get enough rest even when they were ill. They were given some sort of medicine like a painkiller, and would be forced to work. So yeah, the targets were set in either on hourly or daily basis, and it varied by the line of work. And they think that the targets were too high, and even with very hard work, it would be difficult in surpassing the target. And due to pressure of meeting targets, then mistakes would happen, and then they would be reprimanded for that. So dust was the common thing in garment factory, and it was cause of tuberculosis, allergies among workers. And they think that the workplace was not vacuumed. The company only used the blowers to blow off the dust, and some in some section workers would be more affected, like for example in the cutting section, which would be much more dusty than in the packing section. But workplace stress, it was too high as per the workers. They said that the stress was high because of difficult work, high demand of work, as well as unsupportive co-workers and supervisors. And especially the early months would be too difficult for these migrant workers. They were not used to that kind of stressful work. And also there were migrant workers from different countries, and then they think that the supervisors being from different nationality would affect the way they behaved with them. So for most migrant workers, it was a humiliating experience to be scolded by the supervisor or other co-workers in front of their colleagues. And they also, in the long run, they had developed some coping mechanisms like this. Most common was they shared with friends and roommates. Usually with the same expat community, they would share their experience, and crying was another coping mechanism, and this frequent bathroom visits and also to cry was commonly used by the migrant workers. And also after several months, they would learn to retort, like when a supervisor or other senior worker or scold them, they would also find some ways to retort back. But although they wouldn't be able to do that successfully all the time. So in conclusion, so since we have been doing research with Nepali migrant workers, going to other destinations as well. So in terms of the cost, we find that cost is significantly lower for migration to Jordan. And most workers don't pay any money for their migration to Jordan. And this garment industry in Jordan, although it only hires about 3,000 to 5,000 Nepali workers, mostly women workers, it is an important sector, especially in the context of travel bans on domestic work enforced by the government of Nepal. And these travel bans are enforced also because, I mean, they are enforced in the context of abuses of migrant workers, particularly women migrant workers in domestic work in GCC countries. And then, but migrant workers, with these women migrants, are trying to find livelihood opportunities abroad, and then in that context they would migrate to garment industry in Jordan. So that was an important sector of employment for them. So overall experience was mixed. On the one hand, migration cost was low, but wages were low as well, and then it's long continuous hours of work, and most migrant workers would not be able to work for more than 2 or 3 years, and they would immediately want to return home. So, and working conditions were reported as unhealthy and stressful. But still, we found better mechanisms for reporting complaints in Jordan than in many other destination countries and employment sectors. And one thing that had helped in Jordan was the existence of trade unions. So trade unions and the labor inspectors were there, and migrant workers could actually report. Although it would usually be like there were in some occasions they would also file case at the labor court, but it would be a long process, and they wouldn't be able to do that successfully all the time. And migrant workers' rights were within the agenda of local trade unions, but only partially they were covered. So maybe this was also one reason why migrant workers' conditions were poorer. And workers in Jordan enjoy this. They had this freedom of exiting the country when they wanted, but if they returned after 3 years, then the free return ticket would be provided by the employer company. But if they returned early, then migrant workers had to bear the cost proportionally. Like so, after 1 year, if they return, then only 33% of the cost would be borne by the employer company. So there was some freedom, but still there were some constraints. Okay, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you. And if you have any questions, we can discuss later.
Thank you, Dr. Kharel, for sharing about the cost of. Thank you, Dr. Kharel, for sharing about the cost of migration and all the realities of migrant workers and domestic workers' working condition in the industry, particularly in Jordan and its source of laborers from Nepal and other Southeast and South Asian countries. I think it was very helpful that we get to hear about the reporting mechanisms and the labor laws in place in Jordan and how it might also be implemented and improved in other countries. So thank you, Dr. Arjun. So moving on to our next speaker, we are happy to welcome Dr. Anil Yilmaz to speak about the business and human rights aspect of this industry. Dr. Yilmaz is a senior lecturer at Essex Law School and the co-director of the Essex Business and Human Rights Project. Her main research interests are in the field of international investment law and business and human rights, and her research bridges the gap between corporate law, international investment law, human rights law, and tort law. So she examines how these areas can and should interact so as to operationalize human rights standards in the modern business context. So Dr. Yilmaz, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I have a cough, so if I start coughing, I'll take a sip of water. But I would like to apologize in advance. Thank you so much to the organizing team for organizing this 15th Human Rights in Asia conference at Essex, but also thanks for inviting me to contribute to the discussion. My contribution will focus on the potential impacts of emerging human rights due diligence laws in Europe on working conditions in Asia's garment factories. As an academic working on business and human rights, my first direct involvement with questions of human rights and labor violations in the garment industry was after the Ali Enterprises factory fire in Karachi, Pakistan. Some may recall that this fire broke out in the factory on 11th of September 2012, and it caused 259 deaths and serious injuries to numerous workers. Deaths and injuries were primarily caused by the factory's lack of compliance with health and safety standards, complete disregard for the workers' rights. Some examples of this include the illegally built sections of the factory that endangered workers' lives. The factory had no functioning fire alarms or fire exits. Some exits were locked, windows were barred, preventing many workers from escaping the building. Reports have told us that there were over 1,000 workers in the factory on the day of the fire. This was an overcrowded factory. Only 268 of these workers were actually registered as formally employed. This means that there were probably many informal workers in the factory on a routine basis working in precarious conditions. Workers and their families suffered grave devastation and loss after the fire. And the main buyer of this factory at the time was the German retailer Kick. Kick is a clothing discount store. It's headquartered in Germany with various stores in European countries. So it's similar to many other European discount clothing brands that has suppliers throughout Asia, Southeast Asia particularly, manufacturing clothes for its brands. In 2015, 4 affectees from the Ali Enterprises fire filed a lawsuit against Kick in Germany, seeking non-pecuniary damages for the emotional losses and distress that they had suffered. The claim argued primarily that Kick was under a due diligence obligation towards the workers of its supplier company to ensure that the factory adhered to basic safety standards. This argument was developed because Kick had issued a supplier code of conduct that required all of its suppliers to comply with fundamental health and safety and labor standards. It required suppliers to undertake social audits that would check whether it complied with the standards. And where failures were identified, the company required its suppliers to correct such failures. While these requirements existed on paper, their implementation was completely lacking in practice. It's also likely that whilst requiring adherence to these protections and standards from its suppliers, Kick may have also been using abusive purchasing practices, which has probably contributed to the conditions in the factory. As we've seen in the previous presentation, brands often expect production at the lowest possible cost from their suppliers, and this drives down wages. It undermines working conditions in supplier factories. Brands may also place orders with extremely short deadlines during busy periods, pushing workers to work forced overtime or work in unsafe work conditions, as well as increasing reliance on precarious informal laborers. Now, going back to the KIK litigation in Germany, the German court in this case agreed to hear the claim, but later dismissed it before examining its merits, finding that the claim had expired under the applicable statute of limitations. This was, of course, another devastation for the claimants and their families. But the failure of this claim in Germany catalyzed greater support for Germany to introduce, within Germany, for the government to introduce a human rights due diligence law to improve supply chain policies and practices of German companies. This would align Germany's laws with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which in its Pillar 2 expects businesses to carry out human rights due diligence as part of their responsibility to respect human rights. And the UN Guiding Principles also expects and requires states to introduce necessary legislation to ensure that businesses respect human rights. So Germany's new law on supply chain due diligence finally entered into force earlier this year in January, and it requires covered businesses to exercise due regard for the human rights and environment-related due diligence obligations in their supply chains to prevent, minimize, or end violations of human rights and environmental protection. With the introduction of this law, Germany joins other European countries like France and Norway and the Netherlands that have enacted human rights due diligence laws with the objective of strengthening corporate respect for human rights in supply chains. These new human rights due diligence laws emerging in Europe require basically that certain large businesses that are covered by the law, so these laws don't apply to all businesses, but they apply to certain large businesses, large brands or multinational companies that are headquartered or established in these jurisdictions to develop a human rights policy to carry out human rights due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remediate adverse human rights impacts within their own operations. They also cover, to varying extents, because each law is different slightly, that human rights impacts within a company's supply chain is also covered. Companies are also required to periodically disclose information on their human rights due diligence processes and outcomes to inform the public and their investors of their performance. And the emergence of human rights due diligence laws requiring European companies to respect human rights wherever they operate, including within their significant business relationships within the supply chain, is certainly an important development on the path to securing the rights of communities and workers adversely affected by corporate impacts. But I think questions remain over their effectiveness to actually provide concrete improvements in the lives and working conditions of rights holders, those people and communities that are at the receiving end of business-related human rights and labor abuses. Professor Surya Deva has recently described this wave of human rights due diligence laws as half-hearted attempts to tame business-related human rights abuses. And I largely agree with him. While these laws are a step in the right direction, the question does remain whether they're capable of offering concrete improvements in the working conditions and livelihoods of a garment factory worker in Bangladesh or Pakistan, who works day in and day out to sew clothes that are then sold by fashion brands in markets all over the world. Professor Deva, for example, identifies a concern that human rights due diligence may become an end in itself, rather than being a tool that contributes towards corporate respect for human rights. And there is a real concern here. If we look back at the KIK case, KIK had a code of conduct that was a reasonably well-designed one, And it did not prevent terrible working conditions in the Ali Enterprises factory. On paper, it aimed to, the code of conduct adhere to international human rights and labor standards and expected that suppliers would adhere to these standards. Social audits were supposed to be conducted, and they were conducted. And these were supposed to ensure compliance with adequate working conditions that did not prevent, and these audits did not prevent abuses either. So the question remains, what additional prospects are brought by human rights due diligence laws that require companies like KIK to respect human rights throughout their operations and carry out human rights due diligence? It is, I think, certain that there will be a steep learning curve for companies and regulators who are in charge of making sure that these human rights due diligence laws are complied with. And I think the role of regulators or other accountability mechanisms attached to these laws will be crucial to hold companies accountable where they fail to take human rights seriously within their supply chain. So one additional benefit these laws bring to the table is that they, some of them at least, have a level of enforcement and regulatory oversight. And these may provide additional mechanisms for rights holders and civil society to push for improvements in working conditions. But there is still a risk that some businesses will react to human rights due diligence laws by restructuring their supply chains to dilute their links with suppliers that have the worst failings. There also remain serious doubts over how these laws will improve the rights of those working in the informal sector, as they may not be even identified within the human rights due diligence processes of a brand or a multinational company. And this may even give rise to a perverse incentive to push more of the supply chain production towards the informal economy, towards informal and precarious labor. But I think all hope is not lost. New legal instruments, I think, even if they may seem inadequate, and even if they are inadequate in some ways, can open up new and unexpected pressure points. Affected groups, trade unions, civil society, lawyers, and academics, I think, work tirelessly to find new and creative ways to interpret these standards and pursue accountability. And I think that despite their shortcomings, these emerging human rights due diligence laws still remain a step in the right direction. They're inadequate, but I think they can still provide new pressure points to improve working conditions in the garment sector. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yilmaz, for reminding us about the background and aftermath of the Pakistani factory fires, in addition to your informative insight about emerging human rights due diligence laws in Europe, and also the raising concerns about how companies react to these laws by restructuring their supply chain. Next up, please welcome Mr. Namit Agarwal, the Social Transformation Lead for World Benchmarking Alliance. Mr. Agarwal has experience influencing public policy, companies, and investors on issues of transparency, accountability, human rights, and gender. He's a strong believer in evidence-based advocacy and multi-stakeholder dialogue. He has helped design and implement India Responsible Business Index, led supply chain research, and convened civil society, companies, investors, and governments for advocacy and action. Mr. Agarwal, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much to the organizers for having me here, and also congratulations for hosting a 15th conference focusing on this sector and the region. I have a few slides, so I'll just try and share my presentation. So Before I get into the content, just wanted to also introduce where I'm coming from. So I work for the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we are at the intersection of frameworks such as the Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Agreement, and responsible business. We develop free and publicly available benchmarks that help measure and compare company performance on some of these global frameworks. Our benchmarks have helped investors, governments, civil society, and companies to take actions, to think what actions are necessary so that we are able to achieve, for example, SDGs, but also some of the other global frameworks. We've realized that SDGs are interconnected and interdependent, and which is why we have developed a framework of 7 systems transformations. And we believe that these 7 systems are crucial if we want to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And within that, if the private sector or companies should have an important role to play. These systems are a combination of thematic and sectoral. We have something on decarbonization, food and agriculture, nature, digital, urban. We have the financial system sitting at the outside because it has a dual impact of financial institutions and their own performance on some of these frameworks, but also how can they influence companies in the other transformations to also move forward. And looking at the leave no one behind principle of the SDGs, we have put the social transformation at the heart of our framework. And within that, respect for human rights as the basis of this particular transformation. So this is the work that I currently lead within WBA. And within the social transformation, we look at 3 pillars: decent work, respect for human rights, and ethical action. And we have something called the core social indicators, which look at 12 indicators across these 3 pillars. And within WBA, we have a scope of assessing 2,000 companies. We call them SDG 2000. And we have identified these companies using the keystone approach. And the idea is if we have to achieve the SDGs across these 7 system transformations, these 2,000 companies must take action, must move in the right direction so that the rest of the sector will also move. And these companies are across regions, across industries, across ownership structures as well. So I think that's the basis with which I'm going to present some of the findings today. So looking at these 2,000 companies and the core social indicators that I mentioned, what we try to bring forward is a social benchmark, which will be published next year, which gives us the scale and looking at how these 2,000 companies are addressing the fundamentals of social transformation. These are sector agnostic, so we look at all the sectors, and these are applied to companies in different regions, different sectors. In addition to the scale, we also look at certain deep dive areas. The corporate human rights benchmark, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with. It's one of the oldest benchmarks within WBA. And it looks at 5 different sectors, more than 200 companies. It's a deep dive on high-risk sectors. And in addition to looking at policy commitments, we also try and assess the performance of the companies, how companies are reporting on the actions that they have taken. Similar to the corporate human rights benchmark, we also have a gender benchmark, which similarly looks at high-risk sectors, takes a deep dive on some of the gender issues across 2 sectors, food and the apparel sector, and looking at a range of 112 companies. We published a pilot in 2021, and this year towards the end, we are going to present the first gender benchmark with assessment of these 112 companies. And I think in this conference, you might have already heard about some of the key issues in the garment sector, but perhaps my perspective will be more from what commitments companies have made, what is the disclosure scenario looking like, where are some of those gaps. So I'll try and quickly go through this because I feel there might be a bit of a repetition what some of the other presenters might have already said. So I think something that is quite common in today's context when we are talking about supply chain issues, not just in garment, but across sectors, is the purchasing practices. And I think Anil mentioned this in her presentation in the case study as well. And there's a recent article in the Financial Times, which is basically reflecting on several decades of work on supply chain sustainability and what has worked and what has not worked. And one of the spotlights is particularly looking at procurement and purchasing practices of buyers and their dynamics with suppliers. And there is a power imbalance when it comes to buyers sitting in the global north and the suppliers in the global south, and in a very, very competitive market. Some of the issues around purchasing practices are poor forecasting, very tight lead times for completing orders, extremely low margins, which often forces suppliers to look for other ways and unsustainable ways to fulfill those order requirements, last minute changes in orders as well, and often delayed and unfair payment terms, which we have also seen during the COVID pandemic on how some of the payments were delayed or was very unfair. Labor conditions, I'm sure it has been widely covered, so probably I'll not get into the details. And then supply chain due diligence, or the broader concept of managing supply chain related issues. And one of the biggest challenges for people who want to assess and analyze some of these challenges is the lack of transparency. It's very hard to get information in terms of who are the suppliers, where are these suppliers located, what is the composition of these factories, how many informal workers, how many formal workers, sex disaggregated data, and those kind of challenges definitely exist. There is a lack of stakeholder consultation within the supply chain. Policies are being framed, mechanisms are being framed without necessary consultation with suppliers, with workers in supply chains, without understanding their real challenges and issues often in the supply chain. Remedy is another major challenge. The previous case study highlighted the lack of effective and timely remedy very clearly. And I think it's important that processes on effective remedy are standardized, are put in place so that it doesn't take forever to get remedy, to have processes in place. And it's also important to look at the gaps from a worker voice point of view in terms of how workers have a say in what remedy can be effective and what is definitely needed. It's no surprise that particularly in Asia, the garment supply chain have a lot of women working both in the formal space and in the informal space. And there is large-scale discrimination and exploitation of women at various levels. Gender pay gap is a major issue. Violence and harassment in the supply chains is very, very common. Challenges around unpaid care work, overtime, etc., is also very, very harsh. Unsafe and unhealthy working environment is very, very difficult for the workforce to deal with in these factories. And there is a lack of leadership and career progression for most of the women. And it's almost like women coming in and after a certain age moving out, and more women joining the workforce without necessarily seeing that career progression as well. And then pollution and waste management is another dimension of this particular industry. Starting from sourcing of cotton to the final production of the garment, a lot of water is used in production. A lot of waste is generated, whether it's solid waste or water pollution, which is not necessarily handled quite well, and which is very evident if you go to any of these industrial areas where you have a lot of garment factories. It's quite evident in terms of pollution in those areas. Now, quickly getting into an overview of what I've gathered from our own work in the WBA, the corporate human rights benchmark, the gender benchmark, but also looking at another benchmark called Know the Chain. And these are some of the trends that I found were common based on our findings and other findings that I have assessed. There is definitely progress companies are improving, but the progress is rather too slow. And if we have to make transformative change, the pace definitely needs to increase quite rapidly. In our corporate human rights benchmark, and this is based on our assessment last year, which is a different sector, not the apparel sector, but the understanding is it will be very similar for the apparel sector as well. And we will be publishing our assessment on corporate human rights benchmark in the apparel sector around November this year. And what we saw is the share of companies scoring 0 on some of the fundamental human rights indicators, such as commitments to human rights, initial steps of human rights due diligence and grievance, has decreased over time. We have also seen score improvement on CHRP, so which shows that companies are taking initial steps, in fact, on showing respect for human rights. But again, the moment you start looking beyond commitment, the pace is very, very slow. From Know the Chain, what I saw was more companies from the apparel sector are committing to improving on recruitment practices. And I think there was a change from a very low base to show that 22% more companies are prohibiting recruitment fees in supply chain, which was the first case study that was presented. We have also seen a positive correlation between companies assigning board level and senior management level responsibility and the company's performance on human rights. There is a positive correlation based on our assessments of the corporate human rights benchmark last year with companies that have assigned resources and responsibility for implementation of human rights are doing better on human rights due diligence scores. And this clearly shows where it's quite easy for companies to come forward and make commitments on human rights and labor rights and sustainability. They are lagging behind when it comes to taking actions and reporting on those actions. So the tipping point is what kind of resource allocation and responsibility allocation is made to implement those commitments, to be able to track progress on those commitments. So I think from our correlation and our assessment, we feel board level and senior management responsibility is crucial to improve company performance on human rights indicators. Stakeholder engagement, and particularly actions taken on stakeholder engagement, continues to be a big gap. While again, companies are quite vocal and coming out with commitments, and these are policy commitments that they want to engage with affected stakeholders, they are engaging with affected stakeholders. But the moment we start assessing what approaches they are taking, what actual actions they are taking to engage and consult with stakeholders on a regular basis, we found, for example, on CHRB, that 71% of the companies score 0 on their approach to engaging with stakeholders. 23% engage with stakeholders, for example, when they're identifying risks and impact, but less than 5% involve them when they're actually assessing the impact, which clearly shows that companies are drawing boundaries on how and when to engage with stakeholders, which often undermines the whole point of having these policies and engaging with stakeholders. From our gender benchmark last year or 2 years ago, we found that only 20% of the garment companies consult with potentially affected women, women's rights organization, or gender experts as part of their risk identification and assessment process, which means a very, very large part of those companies don't even try to understand what those risks are and what is the impact of those risks. And I think similar data from the grievance mechanism stakeholder consultation, so that almost all the companies don't necessarily are transparent about their engagement strategy with stakeholders on grievance mechanisms. In the supply chain, what is also interesting, and I think we saw from both the previous case study presentations, that companies are not necessarily working closely with their suppliers when it comes to implementing their own sustainability commitments. So what we have seen is companies are taking a hands-off approach, which means that they put in expectations in supplier code of conduct from their suppliers, but they do not necessarily have mechanisms in place to have follow-ups, do trainings, engage with the suppliers to ensure that those policies and expectations are met, and what is needed in terms of corrective actions as well. From a gender benchmark, we saw that while 83% companies screen for gender-related issues among suppliers as part of their audit processes, but only 14% disclose taking any corrective actions or having plans in place to do that. And it's not a surprise that a large part of the allegations and exploitations are in those supply chains, which based on this analysis is not within the scope of what companies are assessing and engaging with. Getting deeper into the serious allegations, as part of CHRB, what we also do is look at or analyze the serious allegations against some of these companies that we assess. Again, these allegations or this data is from a different sector. The apparel sector is not part of this. But again, our hypothesis is in the apparel sector, the situation is pretty much the same. We have seen that almost half of the companies that we assess have at least one serious allegation against them. And only 5% of these cases, companies have actually provided a remedy that was satisfactory to the victims. It's also interesting to note that 82% of these allegations were made against companies headquartered in OECD countries, while the impact was in non-OECD countries, which shows the importance of having grievance mechanisms in countries where there is a perception that the rule of law is stronger, and these institutions will be able to hold companies accountable for impact outside their jurisdiction as well. It was very hard to look at good practice examples which are holistic. No one company, at least from my research, came across as doing really good or having good examples across all the indicators that we look at. But it was also good to know that against each indicator from our own assessment from Know the Chain, there was at least one company that had a good practice example, which means that it is possible for companies to implement some of these sustainable practices, and there is a scope for companies to learn from each other and do better. And again, I mean, these are just some of the names. This is not a complete list. I can share the research report, which has more examples, but I just wanted to give a sense of what are the kind of examples that already exist, what companies are trying to do, and which can help us in being making the sector more sustainable. So for example, Inditex calculates its global gender pay gap across 4 of the main markets using median salary, and also uses a third party to verify its own analysis. Adidas focuses on suppliers to respect their workers' rights, to look at issues of discrimination, even freedom of association, and has a process in place. Page Industries, which is an India-based company, has disclosed internal responsibility for its supply chain targets and supplier assessments at the senior management level, which is quite promising. ASICS disclosed a supplier list that goes much into the details. And I think this is a growing trend that companies are disclosing at least the tier 1 suppliers with the amount of details. For example, in this case, they also disclose percentage of female workers per facility. Marks and Spencer's has a model of cost price, which tries to ring fence labor costs to allow suppliers to pay living wages. ASICS again has a grievance mechanism for migrant workers in its factories in Thailand and Japan. in collaboration with Global Alliance for Sustainable Supply Chain. And I think this was quite common that a lot of the brands are collaborating with international NGOs, local NGOs to implement a lot of the grievance mechanism and impact assessment as well. Similarly, fast retailing has a hotline for employees and workers across its factories, also in local languages, so that they can reach out and register their grievances. Basis this, I think what comes out is companies should be taking immediate action on supply chain transparency, definitely for tier 1, and also move towards making tier 2 and beyond transparent. And I think that is quite crucial because a lot of the exploitation happens in those supply chains. It is their accountability and responsibility to be transparent from where those garments are coming from. There is a deficit between the procurement teams and the sustainability teams within brands. And there needs to be an alignment between what the sustainability requirements are and how can the purchasing practices enable or disable implementation of those sustainability requirements. It's absolutely important that companies ensure that workers in the supply chain are able to exercise their rights and engage as stakeholders and have a say in a lot of the policies and mechanisms such as due diligence and grievance mechanism. I think that's quite fundamental to ensure that things are effective and are able to work. Then having effective and timely remedy mechanisms is important. And given the fact that there are company examples or good examples across all the indicators that we assess, there is a need for brands to start collaborating and learning from each other instead of competing on sustainable practices. I think that will take us a long way. And it's also important to look at issues from a systemic lens. Most of the issues that we are talking about are systemic, and it requires an integrated and holistic approach. And collaboration will definitely help in taking a systemic view to some of these problems. And lastly, from a policy and legislation point of view, it's important that governments are able to raise the bar with legislative actions, but also implementation, because oftentimes what we have seen is that there are policies in place, but implementation is quite weak. So with that, I can hand back to Erica.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Agarwal, for introducing us to what World Benchmarking Line does with different benchmarking marks in place to push the SDGs into social transformation within the industry. And after hearing about all the realities of the working conditions in the industry and the lack of commitment of corporations to provide effective remedy and grievance mechanisms, I think you're sharing on some positive practices and developments from corporates and potential ways forwards. It does offer a more hopeful turn for the industry. So thank you so much for your sharing. Thank you. So our speakers has provided us with valuable insights into reporting mechanisms for laborers, due diligence laws and their risks, and current developments in implementing a more responsible and sustainable practice on corporates outsourcing labor from Asia within the industry. So now we will have a panel discussion with all three of our speakers to delve deeper into this topic. We encourage everyone to participate in this discussion by asking questions in the Q&A function below. So we are now honored to have Andrew Fagan, Director of the University of Essex Human Rights Center, to moderate the discussion. Andrew's research focus, he focuses on the normative, political, and cultural challenges on human rights. He's particularly interested in the contributions in which radical philosophies and politics can make to defending human rights against multiple challenges. So Andrew, the floor is yours, and with all our three speakers joining us today. Thank you.
Erica, excuse me, Erica, thank you so much. Can I begin by just saying thank you to Arjun, Anil, and Namit for such fascinating presentations. Certainly the combination of your academic and your practitioner expertise and engagement with this issue, I think, has provided a really thought-provoking and in some cases, Namit, certainly an unexpectedly hopeful sort of set of perspectives going forward, I suppose. I'm sure people in the audience would want to explore and discuss that in due course and in more detail. So my role really, I have two functions here for the rest of this particular morning's event, which is one to host, moderate this panel discussion. Clearly my principal role is to try and encourage as many of you in the audience, we have a sizable audience this morning again, to raise your voices, to make your points known. There's a huge amount. I have lots of scribbles on a page in front of me. There is a great deal to discuss, from deeply normative philosophical areas all the way through to very tangible, very concrete practices surrounding companies, banks, investment, workers, unions, human rights defenders, of course. So those are all the areas that we'll be exploring. So I'm encouraging you to raise any questions that you have. I will do my best, my utmost to raise those questions. Anil, your hand is up instantly. Was that
Well,
intentional?
I do have a question. If that's okay, can I ask a question?
That's cool. Yeah, cool. Please go for it.
Okay. Well, thank you to the co-panelists for the fascinating presentations. I was wondering, I wanted to ask Namit, if I may, his views on, because you mentioned that now the benchmarking alliance is seeing, the corporate human rights benchmark is seeing that companies have done better in taking the issue of human rights at the board level, starting to actually considering human rights commitments at the board level, which is a great start. And then towards the end of your presentation, you said that there is still this gap between purchasing practices, so purchasing departments and sustainability departments. And I was wondering what you think about going forward, getting the board level management involved in this. Would that provide us some hope that this gap will be bridged? Because I think that's a very practical issue that companies may be able to resolve at the board level if they take action.
Thanks, Anil, for that question. And I think let me also clarify. So I think what I mentioned is we found a correlation between companies having board level and senior management accountabilities and their performance on HRDD. But again, the companies who are doing that is very, very small. So we would like to see more and more companies doing that, but that's not the current case. And one of the indicators that we have that tries to look at the purchasing practices and the sustainability practices is what business model changes companies are making based on their assessment and their engagement with different stakeholders. So far, we have seen almost none of those companies that we have assessed disclosing information on whether what they are learning through all the different policies is it informing their business model changes or not. But yeah, I mean, the idea is to now push companies to disclose what actual business model changes they are making based on what they are learning. So I think that's what we try to do, but we don't have that information available at the moment.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you, Namit. Anil, I hope you're satisfied with that response. Cool. Okay. So my areas of my research were introduced by Erica a few moments ago. I have a more complicated research profile than can be provided in a sort of simple biography, as it were. In the past, I took an interest in ethical consumerism. I'm going to put this in inverted commas: ethical capitalism, oxymoron or realizable ideal. Discuss. I also now I'm looking forward to preparing a book which explores whether a robust human rights project and program can be delivered within the context of capitalism as a broad system. So I've introduced the C word, right? The capitalism word. It's a word that's often absent, I have to say, from these kinds of discussions, and it's a word that's often absent from human rights narratives and vernacular more broadly. And for me, certainly when we are discussing these issues, it's a little bit like addressing the effects of climate change, the human rights effects of climate change, without really talking about climate change, right? We kind of focus upon the symptoms, we focus upon weather changes, we focus upon rising sea levels, but we don't really talk about where all of that is coming from, which is climate change, or in this case, capitalism. So I'd be really keen to hear from each of the panelists, given your own expertise and your own engagement with this. How do you try and grapple with the unmistakable and undeniable context to all of this of capitalism, of which we are all part, right? That there's, I doubt anyone on this planet over the age of whatever who is not in some way embroiled within capitalism. I understand, of course, I'm using capitalism in a very generalized way. It takes many different forms. There are northern and southern hemisphere manifestations. There are historical configurations. But if we just sort of accept that there are some basic features, pursuit of profit for its own sake, the alleged, which is very interesting in Arjun's presentation, the alleged centrality of a laborer's right to sell their own labor freely. That's one of the key distinctions between capitalism and feudal modes of production. Shan't get into the sort of tall grass, as it were, or the nitty gritty of capitalism, but really keen to hear from each of our speakers. How do you understand capitalism in terms of how it influences, affects your work, and indeed looking forward to the hopes and aspirations you have for a human rights-based approach, which each of you in your own ways is pushing very hard for, how that may be affected? I don't know who wants to start first. We want to go in alphabetical order or in some other more random approach. Arjun, let's go in terms of presentation. Arjun, you've been seeing at the coalface, right? The effects of a capitalist enterprise. As you were speaking, actually, I checked to see where my this T-shirt was made, and it's made in Bangladesh. I didn't choose it because it was made in Bangladesh. I chose it because it was probably relatively cheap. It's quite comfortable to wear. So mea culpa, right?
Yeah, same here. Like this sword was made in Bangladesh, although I bought it in Bangalore in my very recent visit. And I was very surprised to see how India imports from Bangladesh, although India itself is very good at this garment industry. And when so I was part of this team to evaluate ILO FAIR project, so which was implemented on Nepal-Jordan corridor. And I was very surprised when I learned about this garment industry in Jordan, because those were not like Jordanian garment factories. So they were not owned by a traditional capitalist, but rather by it's like a more like a what do you call, mercantile. So some of these were they had headquarters in, I think one of them was headquartered in Sri Lanka. I forgot this was MAS. So these garment factories are owned by companies or individuals they from outside the country, and they import. So because of this tripartite agreement between the US, Israel, and Jordan, and Jordan has to import the raw materials from Israel, and then so you get raw materials from Israel, and then workers from South Asia or Southeast Asia, and then companies, they are headquartered elsewhere, and then they are producing in economically free zones so that they don't have to pay much tax, and also because they produce for US market. And so I think so the way this production system had changed, that was quite surprising and to me. And also I thought, like, what about the commitments of these industrialists to the host nation? Do they have any commitment? No, they just make profit, and the moment this agreement ceases, then they also stop producing there. So from the workers, and so it's easier actually for these companies to get migrant workers, and there is this perception of free labor, which is not actually free. There is not much freedom because there is a kind of debt bondage situation. Many migrant workers are paying money, and also they are investing their time to get there. So, and their families rely on remittances. But on the other hand, it's actually much easier for these industries because they can get cheap labor, and they can recycle the labor. Like after, so they don't expect these workers to stay there for more than 3 years. So they want them to go back home actually after 3 years. Most of them, they want them to return so that they get the fresh hands in their factory. So yeah, it was quite an interesting production mechanism.
And integral to a capitalist system, right? I mean, it's not necessarily that people are behaving in a sort of evil or malevolent way. Some are, of course, but others, I assume that they would understand that what they're doing is being determined largely by laws of supply and demand, profit loss, and all those other cold-blooded, impersonal elements of the reasoning that underlies this. Thank you, Arjun. Anil, it's always going to be the elephant in the room, right? When it comes to business and human rights. How do you grapple with it?
Yes, I mean, I think I failed to fully grapple with it myself, but I think one of the important considerations that I look at in my research is looking at corporate purpose and profit-driven model of corporate law that is designed in a way to maximize profit at the cost of other interests and other rights of others that are outside of the corporation or within the corporation, but they're, employed as employees. So I think, the emerging laws that, from my perspective, these human rights due diligence laws, for example, are almost band-aids to fix a problem that's a lot bigger than what can be done with a human rights due diligence law. But I try not to lose hope because we are operating within the system and we have to find its weak spots and we have to keep fighting with any kind of tools that we can get. And I think it would be ideal to find a more broad and political kind of transformation, if that was at the table. And I think we can work towards both goals in parallel, working within the system to improve the working conditions, because people who work in factories, they need improvements now. They needed improvements yesterday. And so anything that the law can provide, even if it seems inadequate, is I think beneficial to pursue. Although sometimes it becomes a box-ticking exercise, it becomes a PR exercise that companies use again, because corporate purpose doesn't disappear, and it can easily corrupt progressive legislation to work in its favor. We've seen a lot of companies using CSR, for example, the corporate social responsibility models, as a PR mechanism to promote and market their brand, rather than actually providing improvements to workers and communities that are affected from their business. So I think, yes, that's something. Capitalism or this neoliberal model of production is something that we need to always keep in mind, because reforms and progress, I think, still operate within the constraints of the socio-economic and political economy within which we live. And I think not seeing that would be quite naive. But on the other hand, I have an optimism that we need to kind of find ways to operate within that model. Thank you, Andrew. That was a really good question.
Thanks, Anil, and a good answer. You and others working in this particular area of human rights are, facing have perhaps fewer successes at times than some other areas of human rights academics and defenders. So it's difficult work. So thank you. Namit, I think your presentation was probably the most robust. I don't think this was your intention, but perhaps the most robust response to the cynic who says, this is only ever really about marketing. You find the CSCR, the corporate social responsibility people are invariably from a marketing background or indeed employed within marketing departments of particularly transnational, multinational corporations. I think some of your evidence sort of causes us at the very least to rethink that, if not actually as a challenge to that. Are you prepared? Are you happy to sort of embrace such an optimistic glass half full rather than glass half empty appraisal of your talk, or did you want to provide a slightly more kind of nuanced and subtle response?
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's definitely much more nuanced, but hope is very important, because I think some of the work that has been happening on making companies and supply chains more sustainable has been going on for decades. So to say that nothing has changed will not be factual. So it was important to kind of show what are the possibilities of change and what needs to further work on that momentum and push companies towards moving from those commitments to actual action. So I think that's what I was trying to show. But again, also going back to your question, I think capitalism is not going anywhere, and I think it will always be there. And whether we like it or not, we have to deal with it and work within the ecosystem that we operate. What is more alarming is the excessive power and influence that large corporations have on policies, on government, but also on people. You spoke of ethical consumerism, but if you look at the influence that companies have on narratives, on influencing consumer behaviors, it's only a matter of time when companies will be able to, dictate what is ethical consumerism and what you should accept and not accept. The trust barometer, which comes out every year, puts companies as the most trusted institutions. Whether you like that finding or not, but I think that's definitely telling of the times that are going to come. So I think it's important to work with companies, work with the capitalist model, so at making sure that we have enough accountability, enough checks and balances to ensure that the imbalance of power is controlled. People, workers, communities have at least a seat at the table, some sort of voice to talk about the impacts and check them. So I think that's what needs to happen, and transparency is very important to hold these companies accountable.
Namit, thank you. Well, so I've heard some amazingly enlightening and thought-provoking things this morning, but that's shocking. I didn't know that. Companies are the most respected institutions amongst the wider public. What does that say for all those other institutions that play a more, one would hope, a more regulative role? But wow, okay, thank you so much. Listen, we have an engaged audience, so we have questions in the Q&A. It'd be remiss of me not to get to those, so let's get to those straight away. Here's a question. This one's for you, Anil, specifically. With regard to the case cited, I would like to know how a dialogue between the government of Germany and Pakistan is ongoing to address the implementation gaps of due diligence policy and the UNGP in general. It is often the case that a state hosting a garment industry lacks adequate capacity to oversee the work of a foreign multinational company. The strategic litigation and/or the policy and law development on I think that is accountability in a state which purchases garment products without comprehensive assistance to a hosting state appears leaving many workers vulnerable and making little difference to the quality of their working living standards. Over to you, Anil.
Thank you. Sorry. Oh wait, I'm gonna go back to the question because okay. I don't know of any ongoing consultation or dialogue between government and Pakistan. I know that they have free trade agreements and investment agreements that is geared towards facilitating investment and trade between Pakistan and Germany. And that gives an advantage to the business entities to have their rights safeguarded, to have their interests safeguarded, to trade more freely. So typically what happens is that governments enter into dialogue at the level of stimulating trade between the two countries, where Germany is in this instance there as an importer and Pakistan as an exporter. And there is a lot of legal protections that are provided to businesses and incentives. But when it comes to protecting workers and standards applicable to that, we've had emerging standards in free trade agreements, for example, that require the exporter country to respect labor standards. But these have not really been successful in terms of improving, again, the working conditions on the ground. And I think developing countries are fed up with these kind of requirements in free trade agreements, because they don't really work towards achieving any meaningful change. They're mostly introduced into these agreements as a way to ensure that the competitiveness of the market is preserved, rather than actually, with the purpose of improving working conditions. So I think there is a lot more to be done in that respect when countries conclude trade agreements or investment agreements that promote business interests. I think some of the work I do is focused on how we can embed into these instruments better safeguards to hold directly businesses and also states involved responsible for failing to improve conditions. I'm just looking back at the question because it's really long. So I think in some ways, global North governments do provide also financial and development assistance to countries in the global South. But there is a lot of problematic aspects of these financing arrangements as well. And I think one thing that, obviously Andrew mentioned when he was talking about capitalism is that we also have the colonial legacies here that still play a role in the structural systems that operate within these jurisdictions. So I think without overcoming those, we can only make incremental changes and not significant and more foundational improvements. I don't know if that answered the question, but I did my best.
Thank you. Thank you, Anil. No, thank you. That was a very detailed response. So as you quite rightly say, a complicated question. Thank you, whoever it was that set the question. We had some other questions in our chat. So these are from members of the Student Organizing Committee, who I will pay due respect to in my closing comments. The work they do is essential to this, of course. Arjun, I think this question is probably best directed at you first, and then see Anil and Namit if they also want to address it. I was struck in particular by the fact that I think you said that all of the people that you interviewed were women. All of the workers in the garment industry that you interviewed working in Jordan were women, and that obviously raises a key point. And this is addressed by the question here, which is what role do you think gender stereotypes and racial discrimination? I'm sure there's a racial component as well to this in Jordan. What role do you think gender stereotypes and racial discrimination play in human rights violations in the garment industry? Were you struck by the need to kind of disaggregate almost into different components, and maybe that speaks to a need for a different and more multi-dimensional set of remedies or responses as well, involving, for example, multiple special rapporteurs, UN special rapporteurs, in addressing this particular challenge. So Arjun, keen to hear your views on this.
Yeah, I had also talked to a couple of Bangladeshi workers during that visit. And also there were some like male workers from Nepal, and with whom I had informally talked. So some of the male or some of the men were working for a longer period, but they were in like more machine operating kind of jobs, which paid slightly better than the other like stitching works. So yeah, so those like a managerial supervisor positions were mostly held by men, even within the garment industry, and those workers were also staying there for a longer period of time. And so yeah, we see that there is a very strong correlation between low wages and high rate of women's employment in the garment industry, but that we also see in other job sectors, which employs a high number of women. Those jobs actually also pay lower wages. So we see that in the garment industry, and that's why and that was also the case in domestic work for comparison. And in terms of a racial component, so okay, so some of the migrant workers that I talked to, like the Bangladeshi and Nepali migrant workers, say that they were also mistreated by their supervisor based on their nationality. So in that, I was not able to talk to the supervisor as such. So maybe just like one group of people saying that, but particularly in one factory, so that was headquartered in Sri Lanka, and then Sri Lankan workers were in the supervisory position, and they said that even when the Sri Lankan workers make mistakes, then Bangladeshi and Nepali workers are blamed for the mistakes, and even when we try to explain, they don't listen to us. So we are selected based on our nationality. So especially in the garment industry, where their workers are from different countries, yeah, so and they are also in different position in this ladder. So there was some evidence that they are selected based on their nationality.
Thank you, Arjun. Anil and Namit, did you want to have a response to this particular question as well?
I'm going to say that I think gender pay gaps and racial discrimination play a role in human rights violations, I think everywhere, and probably more so in the sectors where there are low wages and work conditions are more precarious. And I think it's really important to unpack that. And I think that from my perspective, the human rights due diligence laws that we're seeing in Europe that are emerging may not be sufficiently addressing the gender and intersectional dimensions of human rights impact. And there needs to be more. I mean, I know that a law cannot prescribe every single little detail, but I think the practices and guidelines that will emerge from government authorities to guide businesses will need to really take this into account.
Thank you, Anil. Namit, did you have any views on this you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think thanks to Anil for highlighting the intersectional element. I think that is completely out of all the different mechanisms that currently exist. There are a lot of initiatives that might look at gender discrimination or racial discrimination, but there are very few initiatives that look at the intersection and what happens when both gender and racial or caste-based discrimination, for example, in this region are at play together. And I think a lot of that comes from the social norms that exist. So there is a lot that needs to be done outside of the factories, and which is where a lot of collaboration needs to happen between companies, between factories, civil society, and governments. And that is completely lacking. Government initiatives don't necessarily speak with what companies are trying to do. companies draw their boundary to the factories and don't necessarily want to get into the societal challenges. So until and unless some of those issues are addressed in collaboration, it will be very hard to expect that these issues will not percolate into the factories where the same people from the same society are operating.
Thank you, Namit. You included caste. I would go further and obviously include social class as well as an element of caste in some parts of the world. This is a shameful, if not shameless, form of self-promotion. But I have an article coming out in the Human Rights Quarterly, the next edition, that's focusing specifically upon social class and how human rights has struggled to engage with class for good reasons and for more complicated reasons. So clearly, caste and class play a fundamental role too, in intersectional role in these sorts of in exposing people to these kinds of conditions. But thank you. There's also another question. I'm going to set it for you in a moment, but I just wanted to preface that by really a question to the audience, a sort of prompt, as it were, to the audience. If you were thinking of you're trying to put out a question and you were struggling with what that question might be, here's a prompt for you. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin famously once wrote a book called What Is to Be Done. Lenin was not a capitalist, not necessarily a particularly nice man either, but nevertheless, this is a prompt for all of you. What is to be done? What do you think we should do? What one thing, two things, three things do you think we should do as a human rights community to address the kinds of shameful practices that we have seen? So I'll leave that with you. It'd be great to see some prompts, some responses from the audience. Let's move on now to a question, a more specific question, which also really follows on from that, which is what action should we take to change apparel companies' attitudes to due diligence? What actions are required of us as consumers and key players in changing corporate action in the current situation where fast fashion is favored by many people? Now, Namit, did you want to start with addressing that question, given the focus of your work and your organization's work?
Absolutely. I'll try and give it a shot and maybe also try and address the previous question, which is on the legislation side. I think when we are talking about an ecosystem where consumers have a role, regulators or legislation have a role, I think the expectations from the society, whether it's in the form of a legislation or a policy or consumer demand, is generally coalescing towards the bare minimum or a level playing field. In the due diligence space, what is unusual to general policy developments is companies are playing catch up with a policy or a legislation. Usually the case is policy plays catch up with existing corporate practices or policies and tries to come in and have a level playing field. So I think this kind of shows that expectations of people on what companies should be doing in supply chains is not matching with what companies are already doing. And I think especially in today's environment where activism, online activism is quite popular, this is a good trend to see where expectations of consumers are moving forward of what companies are already thinking. And this is forcing companies to kind of look back and see what changes they can definitely make. And similarly, how policy is also trying to catch up with the situation that exists and then have a law in place. But I think in all of this, what is definitely missing is the actual impact on ground. So for example, I come from India, and if I see consumer expectations from a country where if I step out of my house, I'll be able to see some sweatshops, some factories, and those working conditions are quite evident. But speaking to people on the street, nobody will be bothered about those conditions. And one would imagine that if I'm able to see these conditions and also use some of the products probably coming out of these factories, that awareness and understanding should lead to a different kind of a response. And I think that's going to be the tipping point when countries such as India, China, where these exploitations also exist, the consumers are also there. when they are able to connect the dots and start demanding companies to change behavior, I think that's going to be phenomenal in how companies start changing their behaviors.
Never work with children or animals, they say. And that's appropriate, is it not, to this particular subject? Namit, thank you. So that's really fascinating, right? I mean, and often we assume that if people simply just see the conditions under which whatever it is we consume are produced, that in itself will in some unmediated and direct way change people's attitudes. And that's not the case, right? That's what you're saying, that that's not the case. We need to mediate, as it were, to narrate the kinds of experiences that people are having, rather than simply just allow on brute sensory data, depend upon brute sensory data. That's a really interesting point, right? A really important point in terms of advocacy and education and all those other things that we're also engaging with. Thank you, Namit. Anil, your work and the work of the Business and Human Rights Project and the Human Rights Centers obviously has been dealing with due diligence, addressing due diligence for so long. Did you also want to have a go at this question?
Thank you. I kind of was a bit struck, and I think, you know, I knew this to some extent, but when Namit said that, underlined that consumer attitudes and preferences can be heavily obviously influenced by business marketing techniques, etc. That kind of makes me think how much role consumers can play, how much of a meaningful role consumers can play in pushing companies for better behavior. Sometimes this works, and I think in some specific contexts, things like boycotts or consumer activism can work to achieve some small gains. But I think we're talking about such a massive structural problem that I think consumers' role is quite minimal. I mean, this is similar to, you know, when we are being asked to recycle our, you know, waste because we don't want to contribute to climate change. But we can only do so much as consumers or the members of the public when you see fossil fuel companies obviously contributing to such levels to climate change that what we do can only scratch the surface, not even. And I think this is a similar example. And that is not to say that we shouldn't do things, but I think it goes back to your question about capitalism and the model of the economy that we live in, which is geared towards consumption, growth, and we demand as consumers more and more fast fashion products, and our, you know, public opinion is influenced by this model. And I think one way of us as consumers to maybe influence policy or corporate behavior is maybe to start consuming less. And I'm not saying that this will have an impact on the working conditions on the ground. Maybe it will have a detrimental impact in some ways because there will be maybe fewer jobs on the ground if we consume less. But maybe we need to think about the bigger picture. We need to start thinking about how we can build a different model in our economy and production that will alleviate working conditions and improve that.
Thank you, Anil. Can I take that really important point and address it to Arjun directly, and the migrant garment workers that you've been engaging with, Arjun? What would they want us to do you think? Do they want us to not consume the products that they produce? Do they want us to demand of the people who run the factories that the products that they produce are produced under humane and sustainable conditions? Do they want to not work in those kinds of industries at all? Do you have any sense, any direct or kind of anecdotal sense really of what if there are? I'm sure there is no single set of kind of wants and wishes amongst the complex group of people, but are there things that stand out from their perspective?
Yeah, I think it's the second point here, as you said. They definitely want jobs because they have migrated in the first place because the jobs were not available in the home country. And they also want jobs in a sustainable way. Like, for example, they're concerned about losing overtime work or losing jobs or not having like the regular jobs because of lack of demand of garment products from the US. So they want that, and they want that because they have to feed their family. But they want improved working conditions, living conditions, and even regarding living conditions, they had to live in a dormitory. That was a requirement for migrant workers. But for the local workers, they could come from home, and they also want more freedom in terms of choosing their place of residence. Or like a food, for example, the certain amount of money would be deducted, but the food would not be in good condition, so that they would have to cook themselves and pay extra money for that. So they want better conditions, but they would definitely want the jobs.
Thank you, Arjun. I mean, sometimes the justification in inverted commas offered by company owners, right, is that they're in a competitive market. If they pay proper wages, they will lose their competitiveness. But then sometimes this just looks punitive, right? Sometimes it actually does look just punitive and sadistic. When you think of the practices that came to light through shining a spotlight on Qatar and the building industry in particular that supported the World Cup, some of it just seems completely unnecessary. I mean, I know that's a strange word to use, but in the context of capitalism and profit margins and investment and what have you, some of it actually did seem to be just vicious. Actually, I can't think of a more appropriate word. Listen, everyone, thank you so much. We've exhausted our time allocated to this particular session. I thought that was a fascinating panel discussion. Just again to repeat some of the comments I made at the beginning, I thought bringing together the combination of academic expertise and practitioner engagement, I think made for an excellent kind of demonstration of the importance of theory and practice, and indeed interdisciplinarity within human rights, which is what the Human Rights Centre is obviously all about. So thank you to whoever it was, those of you on the organizing committee that put together such an excellent panel. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for giving up your time today to the audience. Some of you, I see from the names, I suspect some of you are in a rather different time zone to where I am currently situated. This also applies to some of the panelists as well, I'm sure. So thank you so much. I hope you found this conference in both its parts incredibly thought-provoking and hopefully inspiring as well, in terms of how we might be able to move forward and make some progress, to take up the optimism that our panelists exhibited, to take that forward. I'm obviously very keen to consider how we might specifically, concretely, sort of take this to the next stage beyond simply just this really valuable conference. So thank you for that. I don't think I need to make too many sort of substantive comments on the value and significance of this conference. 15 years, I think, speaks for itself. There are actually very few academic conferences that last for 15 years. I mean, beyond the obvious ones, the large kind of, North American, European, whatever, national academic societies and associations, there aren't that many actually that have this kind of longevity. So this is a compliment to everyone who has driven this forward over those years. Most obviously Dr. Sane Fujita, but others too. It's also a compliment to the significance and importance of this topic. And speaks to the extent to which what was a motivating cause for the conference initially, which was this is an overlooked area when it comes to an overlooked region when it comes to human rights, despite the fact that it contains pretty much all of the challenges that you find across the rest of the world. So it's long may it last. 15 years is an incredible achievement, including throughout, and I think memory serves me correctly, during COVID. So massive respect, of course, and recognition to everyone who has made this possible. We will continue to be engaging, as I say, with this particular area. Clearly, the fashion industry, the garment industry in particular, is at the heart of human rights violations in Asia, in the Asia region. So we'll be looking to see how we can take this forward in further work and future work. I'd like to thank again the organizing student committee. There are many people in the audience who are not Essex students. You will not know that many of our students, if not all of our students, in the last few days or so, in the last week certainly, have received their spring term assessment questions. So as well as taking time out to organize this conference, no doubt they're also thinking about which questions they're going to answer for the modules that they've been studying this year. So again, a huge recognition and respect to all of the students who have dedicated their time, volunteered their time to make this happen. It couldn't happen without them. I'd like to thank my other colleagues, of course, behind the scenes, within the Human Rights Centre, particularly the events team, who have made this possible. And I think probably there is little more, if anything else, for me to say. We've come pretty much to the end of our time. Thank you, everyone. I don't know if anyone from the organising committee wanted to make some final comments. If so, I'm happy just to hand over. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. This brings us close to the 15th Annual Human Rights in Asia Conference. We are grateful for your attendance today and would like to express our sincere appreciation to Andrew, Dr. Arjun Kharel, Dr. Anil Yilmaz, and Mr. Namit Agarwal for speaking and sharing your experiences with us. In addition to Dr. Katia Alkateb, Dr. Tomoya Bokata, Ms. Kate Larson, and Mr. Viranta Ginting, our day one speakers. We value your feedback and will appreciate it if you could take a moment to fill out the feedback form that we have provided. Your insights and suggestions will help us improve future conferences. Thank you once again for all of your support in joining us today. Please stay tuned to the event recap on our Human Rights Center YouTube channel and for the publication of the report about this year's conference. Follow us on our social media channels to hear about our conference next year, and have a pleasant weekend and see you all next year. Thank you.